I got a comment yesterday from one of my viewers. This viewer is a native Egyptian. Unlike me, he was born in Egypt, raised in Egypt, lives in Egypt. And he was telling me, Andrew, I'm convinced of the arguments for the existence of God. I'm convinced of the arguments against atheism. But I just can't seem to shake off my atheism. I just can't seem to take that leap of faith, to make that jump. And I don't have any arguments against the existence of God. But still, there's something within me that just won't take that leap. And this is something I've seen in my friends too. I have friends in my personal life who have told me the same thing, where we've had a lot of discussions about apologetics and theology and philosophy. And my friend will tell me, despite all of this, and despite the fact that I do not have an argument against God, I struggle with faith. I can't have it. There's something within me that just won't do it. And this video won't be about the arguments for the existence of God, because there's plenty of there's myriad videos talking about why God is real and why atheism is false and why atheism doesn't make sense. And there's books about this. So this video won't be about that. What this video will be about is, despite having all of those arguments, why is it that some people just can't make that jump, just can't take that leap? Spoiler alert, by the way. The solution to this can be found in the Orthodox tradition. And so, to be honest, me personally, I've never really had this issue that much. Ever since I was a kid, I've been way more interested in the mystical experience of religion, the spiritual experience, more than the intellectual side of things. And I do have a strong interest in both. You will see on this channel, there's a lot of content that really goes in and dives deep into the church history and the apologetics and the logical arguments and the philosophy. Yeah, for sure. I'm a big fan. But even still, throughout my life, I've had a much greater inclination towards the mystical, the experiential. Maybe it's genetic. I have some people in my immediate family, not immediate, but my close family that are monks. And the issue with me is, when I was growing up, my upbringing, at least the way I thought about it as a kid, was really dogmatic. Religion started feeling a lot like a checklist. Did you go to church? Check. Did you pray? Check. Are you fasting? Check, 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 check. And being constituted the way that I am, to really value and experience religion in a way that is mystical, in a way that is experiential, this was something that bothered me. And so at age 15, completely by myself, without anyone's guidance, I found this book called The Art of Mindfulness by this Buddhist monk, and I started reading it. And I started meditating, and I started getting into mindfulness and all of this, to counteract, or as a reaction to what I felt was the overly rule-heavy, dogmatic Christianity in which was the norm where I grew up. By the time I was 16, a year later, I took a class in high school called AP Psychology. And in AP Psych, my teacher was talking about how our emotions and our experiences, they're all just activities in the brain, and there's neurons firing in your head, and everything is mechanical. And this view was so different than the view of humanity that I grew up with, that this threw me into an existential doubt. And so what I would do is I would stay up until 3 a.m., 4 a.m. sometimes, and I would watch debates on YouTube. At this time, new atheism was kind of popular. So I'd watch debates with Christopher Hitchens, I'd watch debates with Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, up until the morning, and then I would drag myself out of bed to go to school by the time it was about 7 a.m. But this phase of doubt didn't last very long for me, because I had the reference of those experiences. When you've experienced something, it's simultaneously the best argument for the existence of God and the worst argument for the existence of God. When you have personal experience with the divine, it's nothing is more convincing than that. You've had the experience yourself. but it's simultaneously the worst argument because that is not convincing to anybody else. You go and you tell someone else that you have an experience, they're going to be like, okay, cool, that's your experience. What does that have to do with me? So it's simultaneously the strongest argument for the existence of God, your own experiences, and the worst for other people. And there's an issue we have in the West with Christianity. Here in America, we have these things called townhouses, especially in the suburbs, where you have one house, it's one house, and there's a wall in the middle of the house, a thick wall. And each side of the house has its own garage. And what will happen is one family will live on one side of the house, and another family will live on the other side of the house, and they don't really communicate. They're just neighbors, but they live in the same house, technically. This is what the West has kind of done with Christianity, where you have the intellect, which is completely separate on its own, separated from the heart. And Orthodoxy contrasts this because Orthodoxy is a mansion with an open floor design, and everything flows into everything. And you can go from one side to the other, and it's open. Currently, online, there's been a lot of talk about the intellectual arguments for Christianity. A lot of the Christian content right now on the internet is really deep and dense, actually. And that's what people are seeking. They're seeking arguments, they're seeking the intellect, they're seeking education, and there's nothing wrong with that. And in a lot of ways, it's a reaction to new atheism that was popular in the early 2000s, even all the way up into the 2010s, where these atheists in the West would paint this caricature of Christianity as this religion that was focused only on emotions, and it was illogical, and it was irrational. And there's the big sky daddy in the sky, and y'all believe in this big sky daddy in the sky. No one believes in a big sky daddy in the sky. No serious Christian believes that there's this dude with a big beard in the sky. That's not our conception of God at all. But this is the straw man that atheists would use against Christians. And as a response to this, what will happen, and what did happen, is Christians then went onto the internet and engaged intellectually with these new atheists and their arguments as a response to this misrepresentation of Christianity. And since there was that separation in the house, remember the townhouse, there's the emotional side and there's the intellectual side. The new atheists were responding kind of to that heart side, the emotional side, and kind of ignored the intellectual side. And so there was a bit of an overcorrection where now there's this strong emphasis on the intellect, the arguments, the history. And either extreme creates problems. Either one of these extremes is an issue. In Orthodoxy, there is an emphasis on the eye of the heart. In Eastern Orthodox theology, they'll often call this the nous, which is the heart and the mind together, oriented together towards God. And there's this connection between the two. Orthodoxy, Oriental Orthodoxy, true Orthodoxy, we have this balance that was perfected really ever since the early church. In Oriental Orthodoxy, my own tradition, the Coptic tradition, was where monasticism really began with Saint Anthony the Great and Saint Paul the Hermit. And you had these mystics who were so focused on the experiential aspect of God, which kind of is mirrored in the pagans of Far Eastern spirituality, where they would go be by themselves and they would contemplate God and they would quiet their environment so they can experience God directly via experience. But my tradition, the Oriental Orthodox tradition, the Coptic tradition in particular, we have some of the biggest titans that have ever existed in theology. Saint Athanasius, Saint Cyril the Great, etc. And Alexandrian theology is a really serious theology, and it's been taken seriously for thousands of years, ever since it really started propping up in the first few centuries of the church. And so we need to reunite what should have never been separated. We need to bring back together that which should have never been split apart. And so the question remains, why do smart people still struggle with this problem? When you go outside, if you're wearing a pair of sunglasses, your perception is altered. You see everything differently. Everything is more dim than it would otherwise be if you weren't wearing those glasses. And in the same way, sin really impacts our perception. If you refer to Romans 1, verses 20 to 25, you will see this. You will see Paul writes that the evidence for God is obvious. It's apparent through creation. You know, and we have in the Coptic church something called the Midnight Praises, where we will often chant about how the sun and the moon and all the stars and the whales that move in the waters and the stars and everything worships God and glorifies God in this symphony. And it's not just the external experience, it's the internal experience, because man was made in the image of God. And since man was made in the image of God, man is a reflection of God. And so if one is reflective and sensitive to their own internal state, you find the image of God. It becomes so transparent and so obvious. And that's not to say that intellectual arguments are not important. They are. Because the intellect is part of the human condition. Humans were made in the image of God. So the intellect also is a reflection of God's infinite intelligence. Think of this analogy. If you have a pot filled with food and you have a fire underneath that pot, the pot gets warm, the food gets cooked, the food stays delicious. But if you extinguish the flame underneath the pot, the food doesn't get cold immediately. Bit by bit, it gets a little bit colder and a little bit colder until the food is really cold and unappetizing. In the same way, Christianity is like that flame. It's the flame that heats up and it redeems civilization. Europe, through the past several centuries, in all its grandeur, was largely a product of Europe being Christendom. That's where Christendom was. Over in the Middle East, Islam was kind of the norm. Over in the Far East, you had the pagan religions, Hinduism, and all of this. And so it's this combination of Christianity and the Greco-Roman legal legacy and the European nations that really was the budding ground, the flourishing of magnificent Christendom. And what happened in Europe is that fire got extinguished. We had the Enlightenment era and reason and everything's about the intellect, and that led into modernism and postmodernism and all nihilism and all of this stuff, okay? And so then that flame got extinguished, but the fruits of that flame, the warmth of that cauldron was still there. But slowly over time, the West got weaker and weaker and started slipping to decline. And now we have divorce rates that are higher than 50% in the US. And we have the situation where we're aborting millions of babies and where content in general is slop. Content when I was back in my age and back when I was a little kid, it was a lot more deep. Movies, films, books, Lord of the Rings, they were a lot more reflective of the true inner state of man. And they had these qualities and messages that were deeply Christian. Now we have content that it's just pushed out for money and it's not even good. And the masses eat up this slop content like it's delicious or something, right? McDonald's content. And there's all of these things that have happened that have demonstrated the decline of the West, economic issues, issues with depression, issues with mental health, etc., etc., etc. And so that cauldron, that pot, is getting colder and colder. But this question from this viewer came to me from Egypt. And Egypt, only recently, in the past few decades, have really started to get a taste of the chill of postmodernism and nihilism and these things that we've had in the West and have been dealing with in the West for a long time now, for hundreds of years. Because Egypt has now been exposed to the internet and online conversations, and they're joining these conversations. And so they're starting to incorporate some of the ways of being and thinking and some of the philosophies that have existed in the West for a long time. And so the cauldron for them is still relatively warm and the fire is dimming, but they still have the warmth and the taste of the food. Their families are still together. They still have a concern for one another that isn't necessarily the case anymore over in the West. They have strong family structures, and I can go on and on. And I'm not saying that Egypt or the Middle East or some of these countries don't have issues. Of course they have issues. They have a ton of issues. But the chill of nihilism is only just now really starting to become one that's permeating through these cultures. Perception is sometimes what's needed, not information. We have the information. We are overloaded with information. But what we lack oftentimes is perception. In Far Eastern mythology, they talk about the third eye. That's a big reason why you'll see a lot of Hindus, they have that dot. It's a representation of that third eye, the nous. But for them, of course, it's pagan and it's oriented towards evil and it's oriented and influenced by demonic influences and all this, right? But they have this concept, this understanding of the third eye, which in its redemptive perspective that we have, it's the eye of the heart, the eye of the soul, or the nous. And it's this perception that really helps us make that leap. And the Orthodox path marries these things together and has had them together really since the beginning, where you have mysticism and experience, and you also have theology. And these things need to go together. And moving towards one or the other is an overcorrection. I have a friend. He is a 5th or 6th generation American Protestant. He's been around for a long time. His family's been around for a long time. And he knows firsthand the consequences of over-intellectualization and how it's separated his family and how it's negatively impacted his life. And so he's gone in the opposite direction. And he has this really anti-intellectual spirit to him. He has this hatred for the intellect, and he'll always say things like, ignore intelligence, just use your gut, use your intuition, ignore books. And that's an overcorrection in the other direction. They're both wrong. You need both. We've always needed both. And so transformation, to really make this leap, what we need is to open the eyes of our heart. For me personally, things that help me personally are things like the Jesus prayer. I'll link a video at the bottom here of Father Lazarus, who talks a lot about the mystical power and the utility of something like the Jesus prayer in quiet meditation. I also like to go to walks in nature because just seeing all of the trees and the lakes and the water and all of this, it's the creation of God. It's this living symphony in front of me, and it creates in me oftentimes this sense of awe and wonder for God's creation. And that's just my own personal experience. You guys might be different, but that's what worked for me. I hope it helped. Peace.